In the heart of Rome, a statue cried, not of sorrow, but of something far older. Visitors whispered of tears that burned the skin, prayers that vanished into shadow. The Vatican removed it quietly, claiming nothing happened. Yet the locals remember, and those who touched its stone never left the same. The cathedral rose from the city streets like a solemn monument, its pale stone glinting faintly under the hesitant sunlight. From a distance, it seemed untouched by time. Every arch, every spire appeared pristine. The streets around it were quiet, save for the occasional footstep echoing against cobblestone. The air carried a faint chill, even in the middle of the afternoon. Leaves stirred in the narrow alleys, brushing against the walls like soft whispers. A slow camera might linger on the massive doors, polished wood carved with saints and angels. Their faces were serene, yet lifeless. The bronze handles were worn, smooth from generations of hands. The door opened with a low groan. Inside, the cathedral swallowed sound. Shadows pulled at the edges of stained glass windows. Sunlight fractured across the marble floor, splintered into reds and blues and golds. Candles, unlit, lined the altar. Silence pressed in from every angle. Pilgrims moved cautiously down the nave, their shoes whispering against stone. Some paused at the benches, fingers tracing the carved edges. They spoke softly, voices low, as if fearing the building might listen. A man in his 40s, an academic visiting from Florence, ran a hand across the pews. He noted the faint smell of dust, mingled with the iron tang of candle wax. Beautiful, he murmured. There was a hesitation in his voice, and that's when he noticed it. The statue stood at the far end of the cathedral, near the main altar, a figure carved from pale marble, pristine and immaculate, depicting a saint in quiet prayer. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, too ordinary. The locals had whispered about this statue for decades. They said it wept. He approached slowly, as if moving through water. The temperature seemed to drop near it. The marble shimmered unnaturally in the fractured sunlight. His eyes caught something, a wet streak along the statue's cheek. At first, he thought it was condensation, but the streak didn't glisten like water. It held a strange viscosity, subtle, yet deliberate. He leaned closer. The smell hit him next, faintly coppery, almost metallic. And something wasn't right. Two other visitors lingered nearby, some kneeling in quiet prayer, others staring at the statue with the wide-eyed curiosity of tourists. A young woman brushed a lock of hair behind her ear and whispered to her companion, "Did you see that?" She gestured toward the marble cheek. Her companion shook his head, unsure, afraid of being wrong. Fear of ridicule mingled with disbelief. The custodian, a man in his 60s with thinning hair and a permanent stoop, appeared from a side corridor. He carried a small box of candles. His eyes were wary. He had seen visitors like this before, eyes wide, mouths agape, hands trembling. He shook his head as he lit a candle and set it on the altar. "It's just the stone," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "The stone remembers." That the stone didn't just remember. Visitors reported a pressure in the air, subtle at first, like the building exhaling in uneven breaths. Some felt a warmth, others a chill. One young man, a student of theology, reached toward the statue. His hand trembled. The faint vibration seemed to pulse through the marble, as if the statue responded. He withdrew quickly, blinking. Was it imagination? Fatigue? The cathedral made it difficult to trust the senses. They moved through the aisles, murmuring. The sunlight shifted, shadows growing longer, stretching across the walls. Each window cast colored patterns on the floors, but some patterns seemed wrong, jagged, incongruent. One shadow lingered on the wall longer than it should have. It followed them. A middle-aged couple knelt near the altar, The woman's hands shook. "I feel watched," she whispered. Her husband tried to calm her, pressing a hand to hers, but his own fingers were cold. They had come seeking solace, history, beauty. Instead they found tension, something quietly suffocating in the air. And that's when he heard it. A faint trickle. The sound came from the statue, or at least near it. Not water, not wind. A slow, irregular drip. 1, 2, 3. A beat that seemed to mark time differently from the cathedral's clocks. Visitors glanced around, unease rippling through the group. The custodian looked up from his box of candles, frowning. Did they hear it? He muttered under his breath. The legend seeped into the city streets long before the first tour groups arrived. Cafes, small shops, even local bakeries whispered of the weeping statue. Children were warned not to stare too long. Tourists dismissed it as superstition, but locals remembered. Old men spoke in low voices of priests who had lingered too long, of novices who refused to enter the nave at night. Curiosity turned to suspicion. A young journalist arrived mid-afternoon, notebook in hand, camera slung over his shoulder. He circled the statue, snapping photos. The flash reflected off the marble in ways that made the face appear slightly different in each image. His pen hovered over the page. Something about the statue felt alive, not animate, but aware. Something beyond reason. He jotted down observations, careful to remain clinical. And yet, as he stepped back, he felt a tightening in his chest, a subtle oppression, like the cathedral itself was pressing against him. Visitors exchanged glances, nodding silently. No one spoke the thought aloud. The priest who oversaw the cathedral appeared, robes brushing the stone floors. His hands were folded, face calm. He greeted visitors warmly, yet he avoided the statue. He lingered near the pews, eyes darting toward the figure, but never too close. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, soothing, yet even his presence couldn't dispel the tension. Hours passed, footsteps echoed, candles flickered, the trickle continued, and still, the statue's eyes seemed to follow. The young journalist lingered at the altar, notebook open. He traced the tear streaks with a finger, hesitating. The metal tang was stronger now. His skin prickled. He pulled back, shaking his head, unsure if he wanted to see more. And that's when the unease became unbearable. A visitor screamed quietly, clutching her chest. Nothing had touched her, nothing visible, just a pressure in the air, a weight on her heart. Others turned to look, but no one understood. The custodian said nothing, just lit another candle. Curiosity had reached its limits. Shadows deepened along the nave. Sunlight dwindled. The trickle continued, irregular, faintly metallic. Everyone in the cathedral paused, some on their knees, some frozen mid-step. The air felt thick. The stone seemed almost warm. And that's when the first man left in silence, walking backward down the aisle, as if retreating from something unseen. By late afternoon, the cathedral felt smaller, closer, oppressive. Visitors whispered to themselves, glancing over shoulders, avoiding the statue. Their steps slowed, their breathing deepened. The faint copper scent lingered. The custodian lit yet another candle, muttering about the stone, remembering. He did not explain further. He could not. No one knew how long they had been there. Time became fragmented. Outside, the city moved in normal rhythm, indifferent. Inside, the cathedral held its quiet vigil, and the statue wept. The young journalist finally gathered courage. Taking one last photo, he adjusted the lens. For a fleeting moment, the marble face seemed different. Eyes wider, cheeks glistening, mouth slightly open. His hand froze. A weight pressed on his chest. A realization sank in. The statue was not just observing, it was registering. Visitors left slowly, speaking in hushed tones. Outside, the city's noise returned. Shops opened, children played, cars passed. The cathedral remained still, silent, but not empty. And inside, the statue waited,
The trickle of tears persisted. No one knew why, and no one dared ask too loudly. The marble wept quietly, and with each droplet, unease deepened. By evening, the cathedral was nearly empty. Only the custodian remained. Candlelight flickered across the marble floor. Shadows pooled in corners. He knelt near the altar, whispering a prayer, but something had shifted. Something was listening, and tomorrow, others would come. The legend was only beginning. A thin haze hung over the cobblestones outside the cathedral. Morning sunlight filtered through a bank of clouds, softening the stone spires into pale gold. The streets were still, save for the occasional clatter of distant wheels on uneven roads. A slow camera might pan across the square, capturing pilgrims arriving in small groups, their footsteps tentative but purposeful. The cathedral waited, silent, immutable. A family of tourists approached first. The mother clutched her daughter's hand, her voice low and careful. "Remember, we don't touch anything," she whispered. The child's eyes were wide, reflecting the colored shards of light spilling through the stained glass above the massive doors. Each panel depicted saints and angels, faces frozen in eternal reverence. The father carried a small guidebook, marking names and dates with careful fingers, and that's when he noticed the first subtle shift. The statue, it had not moved, not visibly, yet as the pilgrims drew closer, it seemed to watch, unblinking. The saint's marble eyes were still, yet they followed each visitor, a presence more felt than seen. A man in his 30s, a seminary student, stepped forward, his leather-bound journal tucked under his arm. He lingered near the statue, circling slowly, noting the angles of light. Others followed, curious, murmuring among themselves. Footsteps echoed in the cavernous hall, hard soles against polished marble, soft whispers against stone. Candles flickered as drafts wandered the nave. The air smelled faintly of incense, but under it lingered something heavier, something almost metallic, and that's when she felt it, a subtle pressure in the air, like the building itself exhaling. The young woman, a visiting scholar of religious art, paused mid-step, her hand hovering near the edge of the pew. She glanced around, eyes narrowing. Others were unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit it. She shivered. The custodian appeared from a shadowed corridor, his steps deliberate and slow. He carried a small tray of fresh candles. His eyes briefly met those of the visitors. Wary, guarded, he offered a gentle nod, wordless acknowledgement of their presence. He did not approach the statue. He never had. Pilgrims moved through the cathedral in measured steps. They examined frescoes, whispered over guidebooks, captured images with small cameras. Each action seemed innocent, curious, normal, but something wasn't right. The statue's tear streaks gleamed faintly under the sunlight. For some, the drops appeared wet. For others, a strange clarity made them
almost translucent, more like memory than matter. A priest, middle-aged, robed in deep navy, approached the altar with deliberate calm. He knelt and whispered a short prayer, eyes closed. Yet when he opened them, he hesitated. The marble figure seemed closer. His pulse quickened. A group of university students entered, laughing softly, notebooks and cameras in hand. Their laughter was nervous, brittle. One of them reached toward the statue, just a fingertip brushing the marble. He recoiled immediately. The coldness was deeper than marble should allow. It seeped in a way into his bones, and that's when he heard it. A faint murmur, almost like a sigh. Not the wind, not the faint creak of wood. It's a sound that seemed to originate from the statue itself. His companions looked around, unease rising. The young man swallowed, trying to dismiss it. Rational explanation failed to form. Curiosity slowly warped into unease. Pilgrims lingered near side altars, drawn to the scent of candles burning low. Some whispered stories they had heard from locals, about priests who avoided the nave after dusk, about novices who refused to kneel near the statue, about subtle accidents, minor injuries, strange dizziness that seemed to afflict only those who stared too long. The accounts were fragmented, inconsistent, yet patterns emerged. The custodian moved quietly between groups, lighting candles, muttering prayers under his breath. He kept his distance from the visitors. He watched them more than they realized. His gaze rested on the statue, careful, almost fearful. A young woman knelt before the altar, eyes fixed on the saint. She noted the streaks of tears running down the marble. She pressed her hand against the cold stone. The chill shot through her fingertips, up her arm, and lodged in her chest. She recoiled, breath quickened. Others noticed the subtle tension, whispering reassurances, but the oppressive sensation lingered, unspoken, and yet they continued to stare. Time moved differently inside the cathedral. Sunlight shifted, shadows stretching and compressing against walls, small noises, the scrape of a shoe, the rustle of a sleeve, echoed far longer than they should. A group of elderly pilgrims shuffled down the nave, their heads bowed in reverence, hands clasped. Their eyes occasionally flicked toward the statue, and in those glances, an instinctive caution, almost fear. Footsteps grew heavier as the afternoon wore on. The cathedral filled incrementally, each new arrival bringing their own scent, their own nervous energy. Yet no matter how crowded the space, the statue's gaze seemed singular, focused. A priest escorted a seminarian toward the rear, explaining historical details. The young man nodded, but his eyes drifted back to the figure at the altar. The saint's tears caught the light in a way that made them glimmer unnaturally. His stomach knotted, and that's when the first audible gasp broke the quiet. A woman standing near the pews clutched her chest. Her lips moved soundlessly, eyes wide. She stepped back, stumbling slightly. Others turned, concern mingling with confusion. No one could identify what had caused the reaction. Not yet. The custodian lit another candle, the flame quivering. He did not look at the visitors. He did not look at the statue. He whispered a line of Latin, low and deliberate. The words carried through the nave in a soft rhythmic chant, yet the unease persisted. Pilgrims moved closer, drawn by fascination and apprehension. Their curiosity had now taken on a sharper edge, bordering on dread. The whisperings of locals echoed in their minds, tales of past visitors who left with nerves frayed, visions lingering, sleep disturbed. Some touched the benches, some lingered at the altar. Each action seemed benign, but with each step closer, the weight of the cathedral intensified. Each footfall echoed more sharply than reason allowed, and that's when he noticed the shift in the shadows. A thin dark shape stretched along the wall, longer than any person could cast, not entirely aligned with the sun. It shifted imperceptibly when no one looked directly. The priest, kneeling in silent prayer, did not notice. The custodian did, just slightly. A tightening of the chest, a small shiver along the spine. Visitors whispered, exchanged glances, questions formed, but none dared speak them aloud. Some felt dizzy, others felt a subtle nausea, the weight of history, of expectation, of unspoken stories pressed against them. Curiosity had fully warped into suspicion. A young journalist, notebook and camera in hand, circled the altar. He captured angles, documented details. The statue's tear streaks gleamed in every frame. In some photographs, the tears seemed darker than the marble, almost fluid in a way that did not reflect light naturally. He stared at the images, adjusting his lens repeatedly. His heart rate increased, and that's when he realized the cathedral had become more than a building. It had become a witness. Every step, every gaze, every whisper was absorbed, and every visitor felt it. The pilgrims exited slowly. As afternoon waned, shadows lengthened, candles flickered. The air grew heavy. Outside, the city moved normally. Inside, the cathedral held its silent vigil, and the statue continued to watch,
A few lingered longer, some could not leave. They felt the pull of the stone, the quiet insistence of history pressing down on their shoulders. The custodian remained, hands folded, eyes toward the statue. He muttered a prayer, low and almost inaudible, and in that quiet, the cathedral seemed alive, not in motion, not in sound, but in attention. The pilgrims had arrived, and the echoes of their presence would linger. The statue had been seen, and that was enough. A thin evening light spilled through the stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns across the marble floors. Dust motes drifted lazily in the golden shafts, suspended as if time had slowed. The cathedral was quiet now, nearly empty, yet it felt attentive. A slow camera might move along the nave, lingering on shadows stretching across carved columns, on the silence that seemed heavier than air. Visitors had come and gone throughout the day, but the statue remained. Its pale marble face glistened faintly, streaked with the thin dark tears that no one could explain. Some claimed the streaks had appeared only that morning. Others said they were nightly. Locals whispered that the weeping had grown more pronounced over weeks. Every evening, the stone seemed damp, as if moisture exuded from some hidden source, and that's when he noticed it. A seminarian, young, hesitant, stepped toward the altar. He had stayed late to observe the figure, notebook clutched under his arm. His eyes traced the glinting tears as his hand hovered inches from the marble. He flinched, expecting nothing, yet feeling a pressure, subtle but undeniable, against his chest. A shiver traveled down his spine, but something wasn't right. The candlelight flickered, though no drafts disturbed the air. Shadows pulled unnaturally along the floor, stretching across the walls. The sound of footsteps echoed from distant corridors, though no one was there. He looked up. The statue's gaze, unchanging and serene, seemed to track him with an almost deliberate patience. Others were arriving, though quietly. A couple of tourists, thinking they had missed the day's light, entered cautiously. The air smelled faintly of wax and dust. Their shoes tapped softly against the polished stone. They lingered near the pews, whispering about the tears in the marble. One brushed the streaks with a fingertip. The metal tang hit immediately. They recoiled, startled, and glanced at each other, and that's when he heard it. A faint murmur, not a word, not a breath, something just beneath perception, curling at the edge of hearing. It came from near the statue. The young seminarian froze. His eyes darted across the nave. The shadows seemed to pulse ever so slightly. Curiosity became unease. That night, a small group of pilgrims had stayed late. They lit candles, each flame trembling in the darkness. Their whispers echoed softly against stone walls. Hesitant, nervous, they examined the statue, noting the tears, tracing their paths with gloved fingers. Each touch sent a subtle shiver along their skin. Some felt warmth, a pulse under their palms, though no living thing was present. A man knelt at the base of the statue, his eyes closed. He whispered a prayer. The tears on the marble glistened in the candlelight, catching reflections in ways that made them appear almost liquid. He opened his eyes. For a brief moment, he thought he saw movement in the shadows behind the altar, just a flicker, a silhouette, gone before he could focus. And that's when the whispers began, soft, almost conversational, too faint to interpret, but unmistakably present. A rustle in the dark, the slight hiss of words between the columns. The pilgrims exchanged glances, their faces tight with apprehension. One tried to speak, but his voice faltered. Another covered her mouth. Instinctively, subtle accidents began to occur. A candle tipped over, not clumsily, not by mistake, just a soft clatter as wax hit marble. A book fell from a pew, pages splaying in the faint light. Nothing, or no one was nearby. Suspicion grew. The custodian appeared once more, quietly placing fresh candles along the altar. His hands were steady, but his eyes flicked toward the group with careful assessment. "It reacts," he whispered under his breath. The pilgrims did not understand but felt the weight in his tone. A young woman, A visiting scholar dared to kneel closer, fingertips grazing the statue's robe. A vision struck briefly, shadowed figures standing behind her, indistinct watching. She gasped, pulling her hand away. Nothing was there, yet her heart raced. Every instinct told her to flee, yet she remained, frozen. The seminarian scribbled furiously in his notebook. His pen trembled. He could not describe what he had seen, only that something had been there, a sense of presence, attentive, patient, and that's when it moved. Not visibly, not physically, but the atmosphere shifted. A subtle vibration, almost imperceptible, ran through the floor beneath their knees. The candle flames flickered violently. The shadows lengthened in ways that defied logic. Every person in the nave felt it, a collective tightening in the chest, a chill that settled deep in the lungs. Unease became horror. One pilgrim stumbled, nearly falling to the stone. Another pressed her hands to her ears, as if trying to block the faint whispering. The custodian's voice cut through the tension, low and deliberate. "Leave it be," he murmured. "Do not linger too long." But they could not leave. Not yet. The night deepened. The cathedral seemed to contract, drawing in breathless silence. The marble statue gleamed, streaked with tears that caught the candlelight unnaturally. Each visitor felt the pull of something unseen, a weight pressing on the mind. A sudden sound, a soft metallic drip, echoed in the nave. The seminarian froze. He scanned the stone, tracing the line of liquid
running down the cheek. It glistened like something alive, and that's when the first panic surfaced. A young tourist backed away, eyes wide, hands trembling. Others turned to follow, instinctively, but found their paths crowded with shadows that seemed to shift subtly when they weren't looking. Heart rates quickened, breathing became shallow. The cathedral had grown smaller, more confining, though its walls had not moved. Subtle accidents multiplied. A chair toppled, a candle smoldered dangerously. No one admitted to causing them, yet each event amplified the tension, drawing the pilgrims' focus toward the statue, toward the tears. By midnight, the visitors had scattered. A few remained, paralyzed by fear or fascination. They huddled near pews, whispering nervously, eyes flicking to the statue. Each touch, each glance, each heartbeat seemed amplified, and the statue continued to weep. The custodian moved through the nave, one last time, extinguishing candles. He muttered a prayer under his breath. The shadows lengthened, curling across the marble floors. Something had awakened in the cathedral. It was subtle, quiet, patient, but it was watching, and no one would leave unchanged. The first signs had begun. A single lamp swung gently above the cathedral's side aisle, casting long wavering shadows across worn stone floors. Dust clung to the air in slow motes, illuminated in golden slivers by the feeble light. The nave beyond was empty now, silent, save for the occasional creak of old timber and the soft hum of evening wind against stained glass windows. The slow camera might trace the arches, lingering on the intricate carvings, the faces of saints and angels frozen in silent watchfulness. He appeared then, the custodian, an elderly man, hunched with years and habit, walking slowly along the corridor that led to the statue. His steps were careful, deliberate, echoing faintly against the walls. His hands trembled slightly, though his movements remained precise. He carried a small candle, its flame flickering in rhythm with his heartbeat, and that's when he began to speak. His voice was low, quivering, yet deliberate. Not a story for the curious, not a tale for tourists. He spoke for those who had ears, those who had witnessed too much. Priests. Sometimes they tend the statue, he whispered. They vanish, slowly, without warning. One moment they are here, the next, nothing. Visitors had long left for the evening. Only a few lingered near the rear pews, faces pale, bodies tense. They listened, uncertain if the custodian was speaking literally or if the weight of memory had shaped his words into warnings. He paused, letting the silence stretch. The candle trembled in his grip. Shadows danced across his lined face. The air smelled faintly of melted wax and dust, and a subtle metallic tang lingered. And that's when the candles go out, he continued, mid-prayer. No drafts, no explanation. One moment, the flame burns, the next, dark, and sometimes you hear it. He lowered his voice even further, leaning slightly forward. The light caught his eyes, wide, unblinking, faint screams, from chapels empty, faint, and impossible to locate. They echo, they travel along stone walls, they vanish before anyone reaches them, but you feel them, deep in your chest. The silence of the cathedral pressed against them. Every breath sounded loud, every movement felt amplified. The young seminarian shifted uncomfortably, notebook clasped to his chest. He had heard rumors before, whispers from the city streets, tales repeated in hushed tones. Yet hearing them from the custodian, something changed. A gust of wind brushed through the nave, stirring the candle flames. Shadows flickered along the columns. The custodian continued, hands trembling now more noticeably. He gestured toward the statue, though not too close. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial. Do not linger near it for too long, he said. Even the most faithful, even the devout, cannot always leave unchanged. Some return, but they are different, silent, eyes hollow, hands restless. The building remembers who stays. And that's when he heard it. A faint scrape, not wood, not stone, something else. From somewhere deep within the cathedral, the custodian's eyes flicked toward the direction of the sound. Alert, tense. The air grew heavier. The metallic tang intensified, subtle yet distinct. The visitors listened, hearts tightening. One hand clenched a notebook, knuckles pale. The young scholar, kneeling near a side altar, felt the weight of years pressing down, not his own, but those of the cathedral itself. The stories were no longer abstract. They were present, but something wasn't right. He spoke of a priest who disappeared decades ago, the young man tending the statue after evening mass, candlelight flickering, marble pale and unyielding. The priest had been found hours later, or at least a portion of him had. A robe, a rosary, something whispered into the darkness of the chapels that no one could retrieve. Another time he recalled, a novice had stayed late, attempting to catalogue the tears on the marble. The candle had gone out mid-sentence. When relit, the pages of his journal were smeared, notes indecipherable, symbols scrawled that he did not remember writing. The custodian's voice wavered now. Age, fear, memory, they mixed together in uneven rhythm. He took a slow breath, and still, some return, but they do not speak. Their eyes, never the same. The seminarian shifted. A tremor ran along his spine. The candlelight danced over the floor, revealing the subtle irregularities in the marble. The statue, pale and still, seemed to observe, attentive. And that's when it happened. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, rose from the distance. A whisper, faint, broken, not a word, not a sentence. A vibration in the air. The custodian froze, listening intently. The few remaining visitors held their breath, sensing what they could not see. The elderly man gestured toward the shadowed arches, voice barely above a murmur. You hear them, but you cannot see them. They travel along the walls, following the stone. A candle flickered violently. The seminarian stepped back. The custodian's hand shook slightly as he steadied it on the pew. Curiosity had become unease. The custodian leaned forward, speaking as if confessing a sin. I have tended this place for decades. I have seen things no one would believe. Candles extinguish, footsteps echo when no one walks, doors open and close on their own, and the cries. His voice broke, a tremor in the syllables. Sometimes I hear them in my sleep. The air thickened, heavy with a sense of expectation. The shadows along the nave seemed to stretch, pulling toward the altar. Every sound, every heartbeat,
Every movement became amplified, and yet no one moved, not until the custodian stepped closer to the statue, candle held high. His hands shook, lips moving in silent prayer. The marble glistened in the light, pale tears reflecting flame. And that's when they appeared, not fully visible, not tangible, but there, faint shapes, almost perceptible at the edge of vision, moving, shifting, watching. The custodian paused, voice dropping even further. Some of them never leave. Even when you think you are gone, even when the doors close behind you, you carry them. A deep silence followed, only the subtle hum of air through stone, candlelight flickering, the shadows pooling more densely than before. Horror had become personal. The visitors pressed closer together, whispering, shaking. The custodian did not move. He continued his vigil, muttering prayers, eyes never leaving the statue. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cathedral itself seemed to lean inward, watching, waiting, remembering. By the end of the night, all who remained were altered. Some would speak of it later, others would never speak again. And the custodian, voice trembling, hands clasped tight, watched them go, because he knew the witness was only the beginning. Morning light filtered through the cathedral's upper windows, dust dancing in the golden beams. The stone walls glowed faintly, but a tension lingered in the air, subtle yet insistent. A slow camera might trace the nave from the altar to the massive doors, lingering on the marble figure at the far end, streaked with tears that glimmered in the soft light. Outside, the city moved normally, oblivious to the presence inside. The first cars arrived quietly, black sedans with polished insignias reflecting the morning sun. Men in dark suits stepped out, their movements precise, controlled. They carried folders, cameras, recording devices. A priest escorted them through the heavy doors, his expression neutral, betraying none of the unease he felt. And that's when they saw it, the statue, marble pale, serene, and yet the streaks on its cheeks had deepened overnight, more pronounced than ever. Officials gathered around, snapping photographs, measuring angles of light, documenting the floor, the shadows, the very air. One bent close, adjusting the lens of a camera. He captured the streaks, some faintly red, others darker, almost fluid in a way that defied natural condensation. But something wasn't right. A senior cleric, stern-faced and meticulous, stepped forward. He gestured toward the tears, insisting calmly, measuredly, that it was condensation, temperature gradients. He said, humidity in the stone, nothing more. His voice carried authority, but the edge of doubt lingered, betraying his certainty. Technicians examined the marble closely. Cameras, microscopes, infrared devices. Photographs were developed immediately, and there, on several frames, crimson lines appeared along the cheeks. Faint, almost imperceptible, yet distinct. Not water, not light, blood perhaps, or something that looked like it. The custodian remained nearby, hands folded, eyes wary. He had seen many visitors, many inspections, none like this. These were men of influence, of doctrine, of unquestioned faith, and yet, even they could not explain what the photographs revealed. A young photographer, kneeling to capture a close-up, noticed something peculiar. The tears seemed to shimmer in a way inconsistent with condensation. Light reflected oddly, creating an effect, as if the marble itself were slightly moist, alive in some subtle, imperceptible manner. And that's when he heard it, a whisper, so soft it might have been imagined. It seemed to trail the officials, brushing across the edges of the cathedral, barely perceptible over the clicking of cameras. Heads turned instinctively, nothing, yet every visitor felt it, a weight, a subtle pressure in the air, pressing against their senses. Tension grew. A cardinal stepped closer to the statue. He traced the streaks with gloved fingers. The red stains resisted explanation. "This is natural," he murmured, but his voice faltered. Even he felt the weight of doubt. Shadows in the nave seemed to thicken, stretching across the stone. A candle flickered unexpectedly. Nothing was near it. Officials huddled, whispering, reviewing photographs, comparing angles, debating explanations. One suggested humidity readings, Another temperature calibration. None satisfied the weight of what they were witnessing. The statue remained still, serene, yet the air felt alive around it. And that's when a small scream echoed softly from where no one could determine. A janitor had left a broom, leaning
against a wall, but the sound had no visible source. The officials froze. Each sound in the cathedral was amplified. Footsteps, the faint creak of timber, the whisper of air, all felt deliberate, purposeful, watched. Curiosity became unease. A young seminarian had followed the group silently, observing the interactions, the subtle flickers in their expressions. He noticed a hand tremble as an official pointed at a crimson streak. He saw hesitation in faces, otherwise trained to exude certainty. The cathedral seemed to amplify doubt, feeding it into the minds of those present. The custodian whispered again, almost inaudibly, "It's not natural." He said no more. His eyes lingered on the statue, tracing the lines of marble as if memorizing some secret. Only he understood. Accidents began subtly. A chair toppled in the back aisle. A candle hissed, smoke curling unnaturally. Nothing, or no one was near. Each incident escalated the tension. The officials' confidence wavered. Their hands shook slightly over cameras. Notes were scribbled with unusual care, as if recording might stave off consequences. And then the cardinal stepped back. A streak, deep red, caught his attention. Not light, not shadow, something on the marble that resisted explanation. His breathing deepened. He adjusted his collar. He whispered a prayer, low and almost reflexive, but the photographs confirmed it. Crimson streaks, multiple angles, evidence that contradicted explanation, defied logic. Officials exchanged glances, brief nods, hushed tones. They had arrived to assert reason, to impose understanding, and yet, reason faltered. The cathedral seemed aware. Every movement, every examination, every whispered discussion was absorbed. The shadows shifted imperceptibly, aligning with the viewers. The air grew heavier. The light dimmed subtly, though no cloud had passed. And that's when they all heard it. A faint exhalation, not a gust of wind, not a breath. Something low, almost human. A sound that resonated in the bones. The photographers froze. The cleric stiffened, and the custodian leaned closer to the marble, whispering words he had not spoken for decades. Suspicion escalated into fear. Officials argued in whispers, their words clipped, precise, natural. One insisted. Condensation, another said, but all were silent when the crimson lines shimmered in the candlelight. Eyes followed them obsessively. Hands adjusted gloves, notebooks, cameras. No one moved too fast. No one looked directly. Curiosity had been replaced. A quiet horror settled over the cathedral. Not loud, not obvious, not violent, but it pressed inward, subtle, impossible to ignore. Even faith faltered under its weight. The custodian remained at the side, steady but alert. He did not touch the statue. He only watched, and the statue wept. The officials concluded their inspections. They departed with careful words, carefully phrased explanations. The doors closed behind them. Silence returned, but the air did not lighten. Something lingered, and no argument, no photograph, no declaration of doctrine could remove it. The Vatican had intervened, and yet the cathedral remembered everything. Moonlight spilled through the tall stained glass windows, painting the cathedral floor in fractured colors. Dust floated in the beams, unmoving, almost tangible. A slow camera might drift along the nave, tracing the arches, the carved columns,
lingering finally on the statue at the far end. Its marble face gleamed faintly, streaked with tears that seemed more vivid than in daylight. The building exhaled quietly, as if aware of those who had entered its shadowed halls. Visitors slept fitfully in nearby lodging, though many were haunted not by dreams, but by memories. The statue had been seen, observed, studied, but even away from its stone gaze, it followed them.
Sir, a young seminarian awoke suddenly,
Heart hammering, sweat beaded across his forehead. In the corner of his room, shadows coalesced unnaturally, stretching toward him, bending with intent. He blinked. The statue appeared there, eyes glinting, streaked with some fiery substance that burned against the dark. And that's when he heard it. Low chanting, words in Latin, soft, repetitive, impossible to locate. They seemed to swirl around the edges of the room, pressing into his ears and chest. He tried to move, to call out, but the voice drowned his breath. It was neither far nor near, yet undeniable. Another visitor dreamed of kneeling before the statue, candle flames dancing around him. The tears glimmered, red and gold, and the figure's gaze followed him with patient insistence. Every time he tried to avert his eyes, the statue shifted imperceptibly closer. The architecture of the cathedral warped in his vision. The nave elongated, shadows deepened, arches bowed inward. But something wasn't right. A woman jolted upright in her bed, shivering, murmuring fragments of forbidden prayers. She had never spoken these words aloud, never even read them. And yet, in the dream, she whispered them, again and again, until the sound echoed off invisible walls. Her chest heaved. She was awake, yet trapped. The boundary between sleep and reality had thinned. In another room, a man saw the cathedral from above, floating over its nave. The statue loomed, impossibly massive, its eyes molten, weeping fire instead of tears. Every corner of the cathedral was alive, shadows breathing, stone murmuring beneath his feet. He tried to speak to someone, to warn them, but the walls absorbed his words, and that's when they all heard it. The whispers, low and insistent, repeating prayers and names long forgotten, each syllable pressed into the mind, bending thought, fragmenting memory. Visitors awoke gasping, hearts racing, drenched in sweat, convinced they had seen figures standing behind them, shadowed forms, indistinct, shifting when observed directly, hovering near doors, near windows, near the bed. Curiosity had become unease. Those who had touched the statue reported new sensations in dreams, hands tingling, veins pulsing with heat, a sense of being observed. Faces of strangers appeared briefly, vanishing, replaced by stone and shadow. Some reported hearing their own voices, repeating the prayers, though their lips had not moved. Each experience left a residue, fear, confusion, and a subtle conviction that the statue's gaze extended beyond its physical form. A young scholar documented his dreams, meticulously, sketches and notes filling pages. Every night, the imagery became more vivid, more consistent. The cathedral's geometry altered, arches stretching, pillars bending, ceilings dissolving into black. The statue moved closer in each vision, closer and closer until it seemed he could feel the heat of its tears against his skin. And that's when he realized reality was fracturing. Another visitor awoke to find her room subtly altered, walls slightly closer, shadows lingering where there should have been none. The floorboards whispered underfoot. She saw the statue at her window, pale marble, tears glinting in firelight, eyes searching. She tried to scream, but sound caught in her throat. Tension escalated. Families reported similar phenomena, objects subtly displaced, doors opening and closing in locked rooms, footsteps pacing hallways empty in reality, but crowded in dream. A faint metallic tang in the air accompanied the visions. Every mind that encountered the statue felt its pressure, its insistence, even away from the cathedral itself. But something wasn't right. The custodian, now a constant presence in the cathedral, spoke quietly to no one. "They carry it with them," he murmured, "even in sleep, even away." The stone for moments. He did not elaborate. His gaze lingered on the statue as if reading a message no one else could interpret. Pilgrims returned during the day, with exhausted eyes, haunted expressions, unable to articulate the dreams. The boundaries between night and day blurred. Their interactions grew awkward, distracted, eyes darting to corners, subtle gestures of unease. The cathedral had infiltrated their consciousness, and the statue remained. Marble cold, unmoving, silent, yet alive. The tears glimmered faintly, catching light in a way that suggested intent. Every visitor sensed it, not physically present, but overwhelmingly so in perception. Reality and vision had merged. The cathedral had become a locus of disturbance, both psychological and spiritual. By dawn, the survivors awoke, some weeping, others silent. Their eyes were hollow, voices low, movements careful, measured. Even in conversation, the words of dreams lingered, the chants, the prayers, the fire in the statue's eyes. Curiosity had shifted fully into horror. The custodian watched them leave, hands clasped, eyes steady. He whispered the same words, low and deliberate. "They dream, and they carry it. The stone does not forget." And the statue, pale and solemn, continued to weep. Night terrors had begun, and the cathedral waited. Night had settled over the cathedral. Moonlight poured through the tall stained glass windows, fracturing into muted colors across cold stone floors. Dust hung in the air, caught in the beams, almost visible as it drifted lazily. A slow camera might pan the nave, linger on the statue, and trace the long shadows curling along the walls, emphasizing the vast emptiness that now felt densely alive. Pilgrims had come for devotion, for witness, for answers. Many stayed late into the evening, drawn by the stories, the tears, the whispers. Yet, as nights passed, some did not leave. But something wasn't right. Footsteps were heard where no one walked. Confessional doors, long unused, echoed with muffled cries. Not full voices, not clear words, just the impression of sound, distorted by distance and stone. The custodian noticed, eyes narrowing. He had heard these sounds before, long ago. Shadows pulled and shifted in corners, subtly but persistently, as if attentive to movement. Surveillance cameras installed for documentation recorded anomalies. Shadows moved independently, figures that could not belong to anyone visible in the frame passed behind columns, across floors, and the statue itself appeared to shift, just enough to disturb perspective, imperceptibly between angles, between frames. Pilgrims vanished quietly, one by one. Extended stays ended with empty rooms, untouched clothing, belongings left behind. Notes in journals sometimes remained, half-finished sentences that hinted at fear, but never fully explained. A young seminarian recorded his observations carefully. He had noticed the pattern. Visitors came for devotion, left changed, or did not leave at all. Even when rooms were locked, doors bolted, the statue's presence remained. It lingered in memory, in perception, and in the building itself. And that's when he heard it. A faint whisper, carrying through the nave. Not a voice, not language. A subtle vibration that pressed against the skull, coaxing a response. He turned, heart tight. Nothing. Only the empty pews, the cold marble, the candlelight flickering in subtle patterns across the floor. Suspicion grew. Confessionals were checked regularly. Each one seemed normal, empty, yet recordings captured what could not be explained. Soft movements behind walls, shadows bending unnaturally, whispers that traveled from cubicle to cubicle, Several priests had reported feeling eyes on them while alone. One spoke of hands brushing his shoulder during prayer, though he had been alone. The custodian did not intervene. He watched quietly. He had seen this before. He had seen faith tested, devotion broken, sanity stretched to its limits. He spoke little, only muttering. The stone remembers, and it takes.
But something wasn't right. A young tourist, staying near the altar for extended prayer, disappeared overnight. His belongings remained, his bed untouched. The only evidence of his presence was the faint indentation in the stone floor where he knelt. The custodian found his candle, melted unevenly, still warm. The statue seemed unchanged, yet somehow different, more focused, attentive. Reports multiplied. Families contacted clergy, seeking missing relatives. Investigations were polite, formal, ineffective. The cathedral refused intrusion beyond observation. Surveillance offered nothing concrete. Shadows and whispers defied explanation. Clergy were powerless. And that's when the panic spread. Visitors began leaving hurriedly. Murmurs of fear circulated quietly. A slow contagion. The weight of absence pressed on those who remained. Eyes darted to corners, checking for the impossible. Each movement of the statue, each flicker of candlelight, became amplified. The building itself seemed to lean, observing, patient. A priest recounted an incident late at night. A pilgrim had entered the confessional and never emerged. He had been alone moments before. When doors were opened, only the faint echo of prayer remained. Not loud, not clear, but haunting. The custodian guided the remaining pilgrims through the empty nave. He spoke softly. "They are part of it now," he said. "They do not leave." His voice trembled, carrying both warning and sorrow. Shadows deepened in the corners. Candlelight flickered over. Carved faces of saints and angels. The statue, pale and serene, remained. Tears glistened along the cheeks, reflecting the warm candlelight, as if it had absorbed the panic around it. Fear had become a physical presence. Another disappearance followed. A young scholar, documenting the statue for research, vanished between the pews and the altar. Security footage showed a faint silhouette entering the nave, moving toward the statue, but no one emerged. The statue's gaze, ever serene, seemed to follow, and that's when the remaining pilgrims understood. The cathedral was not simply a place of faith, it had become a locus of absence. Shadows, whispers, memory, and fear combined to take those who lingered too long. Curiosity had become suspicion. Suspicion had become horror. Horror became collapse. The custodian remained, hands folded, gaze steady. The shadows moved subtly, gliding across the nave, as if nothing had occurred. The statue wept silently. No one could explain. And those who had vanished left traces only in memory, in echoes, in the building itself. The disappearances continued, and the cathedral waited. Morning fog clung to the cathedral's spires, softening the early light as it spilled across cold stone. The carved doors creaked in the wind, a subtle, lonely sound. A slow camera might drift along the nave, tracing the carved arches, the pews, the faint dust motes suspended in sunbeams. The altar, once dominated by the marble statue, now appeared hollow, empty, but the air remained heavy, as if it remembered what had been taken. Every surface seemed to retain a memory, faint yet persistent. The Vatican arrived quietly, emissaries in black robes and polished shoes. Their movements were deliberate, efficient. They carried boxes, cameras, measuring devices, and covered stretchers. Clergy in their midnights and purples followed behind, whispering in Latin and Italian, their tones low, clipped, authoritative. But something wasn't right. The workers approached the pedestal, encasing it in padded supports. Ropes were tightened with surgical precision. Crates were positioned for removal, yet the space felt alive. Not visibly so, not through sound or movement, but the atmosphere thickened, subtle, as though the stone itself were breathing slowly. Officials addressed the gathered clergy, assuring them that the weeping had been nothing but misinterpretation. Condensation, they said, humidity in the stone, misguided devotion. Their voices were firm, methodical, meant to settle doubt, yet hesitation crept into the edges of their words, and the faithful, though outwardly compliant, exchanged uncertain glances. The statue was lifted, the cloth covering it barely moved in the process. Hands wrapped in gloves gripped marble that had seemed inert, yet somehow heavy, weighted with history. Photographers snapped pictures, technicians tested lights and cameras, but the equipment failed, and that's when he heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper brushing along the stone. Not a word, not a language. A vibration in the air that seemed to press against the skull, threading into perception. Heads turned, eyes darted. Nothing, only the empty space where the statue had rested. And yet, it felt full of attention, full of something patient and deliberate. Attempts to document the statue physically met resistance. Lenses cracked inexplicably. Memory cards failed. Film jammed. Lights flickered. In some frames, faint streaks of red appeared along the marble, glinting subtly, almost as if the stone itself had been crying. A young photographer later reported finding a handprint in ash on the back of his camera lens. No one could explain it. Pilgrims who had been present during the removal returned to the cathedral days later. Many whispered of fleeting shadows in corners, glimpses of shapes that no longer belonged to anyone in the room. Candle flames flickered at odd angles, bending away from normal drafts. The air smelled faintly of wax and iron, like candles that had never burned, like tears that had dried centuries ago. Curiosity gave way to suspicion. Clergy tried to explain the anomalies scientifically. Air currents, one suggested, electrical faults another offered, yet none of these explanations accounted for the camera failures, the scorched memory cards, the inexplicable lens fractures, or the lingering impression in the air that something watched. Their voices grew hushed as they spoke, almost as if acknowledging the impossibility of reason itself. And that's when he heard it again. From the empty pedestal, a scrape of marble on stone, low, deliberate, reverberating unnaturally, along arches and columns. The sound drew eyes. Instinctively, though nothing was visible, shadows lengthened subtly, almost imperceptibly. Some began to move against the edges of light. The statue was gone, and yet not gone. A young seminarian returned alone to document the pedestal. He photographed every angle, tracing patterns of dust, examining cracks and stains left by the statue. By evening, his camera had failed, batteries drained, memory corrupted, the lens fractured, notes smudged, as if dampened by an unseen moisture. He left, shaken, and for days afterward, he reported seeing the statue in his peripheral vision, pale marble, streaked with crimson, observing. Even the faithful felt it. Pilgrims who had left months earlier reported recurring dreams, visions of the marble figure, eyes that glowed faintly in darkness, tears shimmering as if aflame. Some awoke with hands tingling, hearts racing, a weight in the chest that pressed downward, persistent. The cathedral itself seemed alive without the statue. Air moved unpredictably. Shadows stretched across floors and walls at angles that defied reason. Voices echoed when no one spoke. Steps fell in corridors empty to the eye, leaving the impression that someone, or something, was pacing.
always waiting. Suspicion escalated into fear. One priest, alone late one evening, described a faint touch on his shoulder while kneeling before the empty altar. He turned. Nothing, only the echo of his own prayer, distorted. Another saw a shadow detach itself from a column and drift toward the central aisle, then vanish near the apse. Each anomaly was subtle, each impossible, each undeniable. And that's when he realized denial could not erase influence. The Vatican insisted the statue's removal had ended all phenomena. Official statements called the reports misinterpretation, superstition, exaggeration. Yet the faithful and the curious observed differently. Equipment malfunctioned, shadows moved independently. The air itself seemed charged with intent. Even visitors who stayed briefly sensed it. The pressure, the attention, the silent insistence of memory preserved in stone. Curiosity had become dread, horror had become collapse, and yet no one could alter the outcome. The cathedral remembered everything, every whispered prayer, every tear shed, every fear inflicted. The statue's absence was physical only. Its presence remained in the architecture, in the dust, in the shadows, in the air. Every glance, every movement, every breath carried memory. The custodians, silent and watchful, spoke in hushed tones. "It leaves its mark," one whispered. Even when gone, and outside the city moved normally. Cars passed, pedestrians walked. The wind carried scents of bread and stone. The world believed the issue resolved. Inside the cathedral waited. Shadows pulled in corners, flickered in candlelight, lingered against the altar. The space exhaled quietly, patiently. The influence denied and unseen, pressed against the minds of those who remained. And the witnesses, powerless, felt it still. The statue was gone, but it had never left. Moonlight draped itself across the cathedral's nave, sliding through stained glass to scatter jagged shapes across polished stone. Dust rose lazily in the quiet, drifting in shafts of silver light. The building felt larger than life, and smaller, at once sacred, hollow, attentive. The pews were empty, yet every surface seemed to vibrate with memory. Those who had remained spoke in hushed tones. Regulars, priests, seminarians, pilgrims began reporting subtle disturbances at first. A misaligned candle, a shifting shadow, the faint metallic scent of something burned that no one could locate. Nothing overt, but the pressure, the sense of being observed grew intolerable. But something wasn't right. Dreams once confined to night began merging with waking life. Visitors described glimpsing the statue in corners of the nave, where it no longer stood. Pale marble eyes followed their steps. Tears glinted faintly in light that wasn't there. Whispered prayers or accusations slipped through walls, brushing at ears and chest alike. A priest knelt before the altar, notebook open. He heard his own confessions replayed, not the words of others, his own sins, articulated in soft, deliberate whispers, carried back to him as if the cathedral itself had memorized them. He shook, heart hammering. His pen froze, and that's when he heard it. A faint rustle from the corner, low and deliberate, yet impossible to locate. Shadows stretched, bending the edges of walls and floor. Candlelight flickered violently, though drafts were absent. He blinked. The figure of the statue seemed briefly present, pale tears glimmering, attentive, gone before he could call out. Emotional collapse began subtly. Sleep-deprived pilgrims arrived at morning prayers, pale, eyes hollow. Some wept quietly in corners, others muttered prayers aloud, repetitions spilling from mouths without conscious thought. Their faith, once firm, felt hollowed. Devotion became terror, hope became dread. A young seminarian recounted seeing the nave elongate before him. Shadows pooled like thick liquid, stretching across pews and columns. The statue's gaze, though physically absent, seemed to exert pressure against his chest. Steps echoed in corners where no one walked. Air felt dense, compressing lungs and thoughts alike. Curiosity had been replaced by unease. Those who attempted rational explanations faltered. A cardinal whispered to a colleague, "It is not the statue that has left. It is us." Eyes darted to empty corners. A candle flickered, revealing the
faintest impression of a figure leaning toward the priest, whispering, and that's when he heard it again. A low, sibilant voice, repeating fragments of his sins back to him, not judgmental, not threatening in tone, calm, patient, persistent. It seemed to emanate from walls, floor, air, and memory simultaneously. His own thoughts became alien. He could no longer tell if the whispers existed outside his mind or had been born there by the cathedral itself. Visitors reported similar experiences. Objects shifted subtly. Footsteps echoed unnaturally. Shadows appeared to drift independently. Light fractured across stone, revealing shapes unaccounted for. Pilgrims fled for air, then returned, unable to stay away. Sleep became a liability, consciousness a burden, but something wasn't right. One parishioner described staring at the empty altar for hours. He felt it watching him, a weight pressing through memory, through past guilt, through longing. The tears had disappeared from the marble, but the sensation remained, an intimate knowledge of every regret, every unspoken thought. His faith, once a shield, had become a lens into his own failings. Collapse spread, his mind frayed slowly. Then abruptly, one woman was found weeping silently in the nave. Hands pressed against stone columns, her notebook was filled with fragmented sentences, names, dates, prayers, complaints, confessions, nothing coherent, yet each page radiated fear. Another priest was discovered pacing near the entrance, murmuring his sins to the air, convinced someone, or something, was listening and judging. The cathedral had become a vessel of perception. Every heartbeat echoed in empty corridors. Every breath seemed magnified. Reality flexed in subtle ways. The length of a hallway, the depth of shadow, the tilt of a column. Pilgrims awake at dawn spoke of waking inside dreams, of impossible continuity between visions and life. They could not distinguish waking from sleeping. Time became fluid, and that's when they heard it. Not a single voice, but many, layered, echoes of prayers, confessions, whispers of dreams. The cathedral seemed to answer itself, refracting memory and guilt back into its occupants. Tears past and present seemed to glint faintly on invisible marble. The building exhaled, patient, measured. Horror deepened. Faith faltered, rituals failed. The belief no longer shielded the mind from attention, from scrutiny, from perception. Devotion had been tested, and the test had no answer. Eyes darted, hands shook, hearts raced. Those present felt the hollow core of their own spirituality exposed, mirrored back by a presence unseen but unrelenting. A final tremor passed through the cathedral. Candles flickered out simultaneously. Silence swallowed every corner. Pilgrims collapsed where they stood, or knelt. Some sobbed, some muttered incoherently. A young seminarian pressed his face to the stone floor, hands shaking. He whispered, "It sees everything." Curiosity had fully descended into horror. Collapse was total. The cathedral, still and silent, waited. To memory, shadow, stone, and air retained every fear, every guilt, every soul. And the statue, though absent, continued to watch. Even the faithful understood. Faith itself could not shield them anymore. The building exhaled quietly, and those who remained, those who had stayed too long, felt the weight of remembrance pressing upon them, insistent, unrelenting, eternal. Morning light filters through the cathedral's high windows, fracturing into pale ribbons across worn stone floors.
Dust drifts lazily in the beams, moving almost imperceptibly. The nave is vast, silent, reverent. The air is thick with memory. Every surface seems to hold the echoes of events no one speaks of, yet everyone remembers. Pilgrims arrive in small groups. They kneel, bow, whisper prayers. Candles flicker in slow, hypnotic rhythm. The building feels alive, not in motion, but in attentiveness. Every gaze toward the empty pedestal carries a subtle weight, a reminder of absence, but something wasn't right. Even though the statue has been removed, its presence lingers. Visitors speak in quiet tones of the sensation of being observed. Some report feeling their own sins reflected back at them, the memory of the statue's gaze pressing at the corners of perception. Whispered thoughts seem amplified in the hushed acoustics of the nave, and the slightest shadow bends at angles that feel deliberate, intentional. The young woman sits in a pew, notebook open, recording observations. Her handwriting trembles slightly. She writes of the silence, of footsteps she imagines behind her, echoing faintly, then fading, of candlelight that seems to pulse in tandem with her heartbeat. She wonders if it is memory playing tricks, or something more, and that's when he heard it. A subtle scrape of stone on stone, barely perceptible, from the pedestal where the statue once stood. No one is there. No one could have caused it, yet the sound echoes in the emptiness, resonating with quiet insistence. Pilgrims glance nervously, muttering soft prayers, voices low, almost swallowed by the building itself. The cathedral's influence is subtle but pervasive. Visitors report faint drafts that brush their skin with intention. Shadows stretch and fold, as if replaying events from months or years prior. Light fractures unexpectedly through stained glass, revealing shapes in peripheral vision. Some swear they see a glint of pale marble in corners that are otherwise empty. Curiosity becomes unease. A middle-aged priest walks along the nave, hands clasped behind his back. He speaks softly to himself, reciting prayers. Every word seems amplified, absorbed by stone, then returned as a faint echo. The hollowed air carries memory, like a scent. The statue is gone, but its legacy persists in subtle distortions of perception. And that's when she heard it, a whisper, low and insistent, threading through the nave. It is not a threat, not audible clearly, but it conveys presence. Observers feel it pressing against memory, stirring recollection, coaxing at unspoken fears. Some shiver, some clasp rosaries tighter, all sense a lingering attentiveness, as if the building itself continues to watch, to remember, to judge. Pilgrims leave in small numbers, hurrying down echoing corridors, yet even in departure, they carry a shadow, a weight pressed upon the chest, a sense that curiosity itself can have consequences, that faith, once a refuge, can be tested in ways invisible but enduring. The custodians move silently, guiding the faithful, offering gentle directions. Their faces betray nothing, yet their eyes carry quiet acknowledgement. The cathedral has absorbed what was removed, the marble tears, the whispers, the collapse of those who lingered too long. But something wasn't right. Even in day, the light seems colder in certain corners. Shadows bend unnaturally. Faint impressions of movement linger on stone floors. Candles lit for prayer sometimes burn unevenly, wax pooling in impossible shapes. Pilgrims note the sensation of breath on their necks, or a glance brushing against them from an empty aisle. They cannot see it, cannot name it, yet know it is there. Observation becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes reflection. Those who study the cathedral after the removal speak of lingering traces, equipment malfunctioning, cameras failing, photographs corrupted with glimmers of red. They cannot capture what remains. It cannot be held, only remembered. And that's when he realized the statue's removal did not end the influence. Its legacy is preserved in perception, in memory, in the air itself. Faith and curiosity, intertwined, left residue on all who entered, a moral warning, embedded in stone and silence. The building is patient, the pedestal empty, yet full. Horror has receded, but unease endures. Collapse has passed, but the echoes remain. Visitors leave, but the cathedral does not forget. Its presence lingers like a quiet admonition that faith, curiosity, and a search for truth can lead one to witness things best left unseen. The nave exhales slowly, dust settles again, light shifts, shadows stretch, and in the quiet, the statue's memory waits for those who return, for those who remember, for those who still dare to look. Silence remains, and it speaks. The statue is gone, but what it left behind is not.